entertainment.
Hello and welcome to Codelicious. In this video we demonstrate how you can create a 3D carousel from scratch using vanilla JavaScript and CSS. Before we continue, please subscribe to Codelicious, like this video, and comment down below. Now let's begin. Alright, so now once you open your coding application and you have included the HTML file, CSS file, and JavaScript files, you can see we already included the basic building blocks of HTML file. Our CSS file is empty and our JavaScript file is empty. We also have our images folder, which has the images that we're going to be using for the carousel, which is these ice cream cones. And now we are going to head straight to creating our first element, which is going to be the container of the carousel. And so we're just going to call this carousel or slider container. So now this is going to contain the UL, and the UL is going to contain all of the list elements, but we're not going to be including the list elements through HTML, but through the JavaScript code that we're going to be adding later on. So we're going to leave that empty, and we're going to create another section, which is going to be the button section. So we're going to create two buttons, and before that we're going to assign this to a ID, and we're going to call this button container. Then we're going to create two buttons. One should be previous and one should be next. Now we're not going to style our button for this video since our main focus is the carousel, and we're going to add a class for the previous button so that we can select it in our JavaScript file later on, and we're going to call this previous button. Alright, so now when we check our page, we can see our previous button and our next button available. So now we're going to head over to our style sheet, which is completely empty, and we're going to start by selecting all of the elements that we're going to be including, and we want to remove any default spacing, that margin spacing or padding spacing, so outer spacing or inner spacing that an element might have. So we're going to use margin to remove any outer spacing by default that an element might be that an element might have by default, and padding spacing, which is spacing inside an element. So now we're going to select the container, and we've called this slider container. Now the first thing that we're going to be including, so basically we're going to be using this container not to design it, but just as an anchor for our carousel. So one thing that we need is to set the width to 100%. We want this carousel to be centered towards the middle of the page, so we're going to use display flex in order to help us to do that. We're going to justify every element that is going to be included in this container to be centered, and we're also going to place items. So justify content will center the element, the UL list will center it horizontally center, while place items will center it vertically. Then another thing is we're going to set the height, and we're going to set it to about 90 viewport height. Viewport height meaning the screen's height, so from here to here. So we've set it to 90, so it's basically like saying 90% of this page. Alright, so now we are going to work on our unordered list element. So this unordered list is going to contain all the elements that are going to be in the carousel. So the first things first, we're just going to set the width and height, and we're going to set it to around 800 pixels as well as the height. So we're setting this, and we need to ensure that the width and the height are the same size because we're going to be creating a circle. So we're just going to add a border so that we can see how our element is going to progress as we continue. So the width and height must be equal so that we can add, as we add border radius and we're going to set it to 50%, we create a nice circle. And another thing is, usually by default an unordered list will have these bullet points, so we're going to remove these bullet points through this property list style. Alright, so now another thing that we want to include now is we want to start creating the 3D effect, and we want our parent element to basically attain a 3D perspective. And something that will help us with that is the transform property, and we can basically use this property called perspective, which allows us to make that happen. And when we set it to a value such as 1000 pixels or greater than that, it will create a 3D perspective for our parent element. So right now it is in a 3D perspective, but we got to we can rotate it a little bit so that we can see that effect. So we can set it to say 50 degrees and horizontally, and you can see that it has rotated 50 degrees. If we set it to, for example, a value that's near 90 degrees, like 80 degrees, we can see that it looks more rotated. So we can see that our 3D effect is starting to show. However, if you set it to a value such as 90 degrees, 180 degrees, and such, it will be invisible. So it's there. It's only that it appears available from our perspective. So we have to set it to a value that's around, not too far from 90 degrees, so that our carousel can look nice. We can see all of the elements from the back, side, and front as well. Alright, so another thing that we have to include is we are going to include this property called transform style, and basically we want to ensure that the elements that are going to be inside will also have that same perspective, that 3D perspective. So we're going to use this value called preserve 3D, and it will ensure that all the list elements that we're going to be including will also follow that 3D perspective as the parent element is. Alright, so now one more thing that we're going to be including is we want to use position relative, and that's because we're going to be using position absolute for our for the list elements, the elements of the carousel. And basically what we want to do is we want to set all of the elements to start originally towards the center, and so that we can set a specific rotation value so that they are specifically placed in different places in the circle, since they're not all going to be in the same line. They're going to be in different parts of the circle, and we're going to be using rotation later on in JavaScript and other different properties to help us to make that possible. So we are going to use position absolute in order to set the top and the left value to be towards the center. So now we're going to be working on our list elements, and the first thing we're going to add is position absolute. We're going to set the top value and the left value in JavaScript. Alright, another thing that we're going to be including is transform style, because once again we're going to be adding images in our list elements. So that's a child of the list element, and because we want the images to maintain that perspective, that 3D perspective, and we want to be able to view that image, on the screen, it should not be flat as this circle, it should stay upright. We're going to be using transform style in order to preserve that 3D perspective. Now, another thing that we are going to be including is we want to create a smooth transition, so later on when we work with previous and next, we want the elements to move from wherever the position is to the next position smoothly, because not only is the position changing, the width and height is going to be changing. Like for example, the middle element will be the biggest, and it gets smaller and smaller, smallest, and then a little slightly bigger, biggest. So it's going to so the width and height is also changing, the position is changing, and there are other factors that are changing as well. So we want that transition to be smooth, so we're going to set it by 0.5 seconds, and we want it both ways. When the width or height or whatever property increases or decreases, we want it smooth in both ways. Now the next element that we're going to be working on is the image, and we want to ensure that the width and height of the image, it takes up the full width and height of the list elements dimensions. Another thing is we want to ensure that the image will fully cover the list element and will not be stretched, will not be squeezed, will fit perfectly. So we want it to cover the full list element. Another thing is we want to also set the transform value, basically, so that we can rotate it as well. So right now, as you can see, the parent element to the image, it's really the grandparent element, is set to 75 degrees. So it's right now set slightly downwards, and as you can see, it's slightly horizontally downwards. But we want the image to stay upright. We want the image to be sort of like in this position. We want it to be looking at us or facing us upright. But while the parent element should stay in this rotation angle. So we're going to basically kind of like reverse what the parent element or the grandparent element does, which is the rotation of 75 degrees, and we want to reverse that so that 75 minus 75, they cancel out each other and become 0. So the actual value will ensure that the image is facing us upright, basically. And then another thing that we're going to be including, which we'll see later on, is filter. And we want to add a shadow. Now this is just for design purposes, and it's optional. So we can make our images, the images that we're going to be including, to have a little bit of shadow. It creates a more 3D effect. So we're going to use basically how you would do it with box shadow, the first value being the left or right value. We're going to set it to 0, but we want to set the shadow a little bit downwards so that we can see that shadow downwards. And then we're going to set the blur radius to 10 pixels, and then we're going to be setting the color of that shadow. We're going to set it to black. However, we want it to be slightly transparent, so we're going to set it by 0.3, 0 being fully transparent, 1 being not transparent at all, fully opaque. So we're going to set it to 0.3 so that it is transparent, and slightly transparent. Alright, so now the last thing that we're going to be working on is on the buttons section. So we're not going to do much designing for this video, however we're just going to focus on the carousel. So we're just going to select the container of this button, which we know we've called it button container. So we're going to select this with a hashtag since it is an ID. And basically we're just going to add a little bit of spacing so that it looks a little more clear. And then another thing that we're going to add is whenever the button, the cursor hovers around the button, the cursor should turn into a pointer. So right now, when we hover around the button, it turns into a pointer. However, before it only did this, so it didn't really indicate whether the button was being hovered on. So we like there to be a visual sign that the button is being hovered on. Alright, so now we're done with the CSS side of our carousel, so we're going to head over to our JavaScript file. So the first thing that we're going to do is add an event listener, and this is so that we can select the container accurately, because we want to be able to select the container. And in order to select the container or the elements and the other elements including the buttons, we have to ensure that everything in the document has been loaded so that we are able to select or access that element accurately without any errors. Because if we did not use DOM content loaded, then maybe perhaps we would have used or tried to access an element that still hasn't been loaded yet. So we have to ensure that the whole page, the whole document has been loaded. So once that has been loaded, now we are able to select our container. So we're going to select specifically the unordered list where we'll be appending all the list elements in. So we're going to call this constant container. I'm going to use query selector in order to select the unordered list. Next is we're going to select the previous button and the next button so that when it is clicked, something changes, the carousel changes. So we're going to use query selector once again, and it is just one button. And we know that the class that we have assigned it to is called previous button. So we're going to select it with a dot, as that is how you select a class, previous button. And then the same thing, just copy and paste and just change it to next, from previous to next button. Alright, so now the next thing that we're going to do is we want to first specify how big or how wide each element is going to be. So basically the width of each of these elements. So we're going to create a constant and we're going to call this element diameter. So diameter, aka the width of the element, we're going to set it to 200 pixels. So they should be 200 pixels wide. Now, before we continue, we're going to create a constant and we're going to call this n. So n standing for number of elements that we want in this carousel. So we want there to be specifically 8. Now, this number is not strict, should not be strict. However, it should be strict in this JavaScript file, but you can change it to 11, to 20, or to 5, to 3, depending on your criteria or your requirements. So we're going to set it to 8 for now. So now we are able to create a for loop, and we're able to go through this loop 8 times where we create those list elements, and we're going to add the images to those list elements 8 times. So there'll be 8 elements in total created through this loop. So we're going to set the length being n, starting from 0 to 7, and increment. Alright, so now we're going to create our list elements, our list items. So we're first going to have to create a new element using the create element method. And so we want to create a list item. Then we're going to create images and we're going to append this to the list items. So we're going to again create a new image element. So now we are going to select the image and we're going to set the source. So when we check our folder, we can see that it is called images folder, so we can start writing the path. And so when we check our folder, we can see we have 8 items. It depends on how many elements that you have in your carousel. So in this video we're going to be working with 8 elements. So with that, we're going to select them, and we see that they all start with a 0. So if there was 9 items, the last item would be 09, but then if there were 10 items, it would be just 10, it wouldn't be 010. So we have to use a specific kind of method so that we can try and track what number this element is, and then add a 0 if it's one single digit, and not to bother if it already has 2 digits basically. So now with these special strings, we are able to add a variable with a $sign and curly brackets. And so what we want to do is we want to get the current element, element that is being processed. So whatever I currently is, the value of I, whether it's 0, 1, 2, 3. Now because our elements start from 1 rather than from 0, 0, we have to increase or increment I by 1. But another thing is we have to include a method. And with this, we have to first convert this to a string so that we can use this method. And so with this, we're going to use this method called pad start. And what we do here is, as you can see here, we have to add the max length of this number, that this number should be. So we can now add the criteria. So the maximum length of this number should be 2. And so if it's just one number or one digit, then so if it's less than the limit that we set, then we have to fill it with a specific value. So we want to fill it with the value of 0. So this is very helpful in cases where maybe you have more than 9 elements, you have 10, 11, 12 elements, and you're not going to add 0, 11, 0, 12. It's just going to be 12, 13, 14. So it's very helpful in that case. Although it's not in our case, it's something that should be considered if you have more than 9 items in your carousel. And the last thing that we have to do is add the image format. So we're using PNG. All of our elements are in PNG file format. So now we're going to append this image with append child, and we're going to append this image, and then we're going to append this list item into the container or the unordered list here. So now we have started to see our images. They are not yet layered properly, but we're going to work with that very soon. Alright, so now what we want to do is we want to work on the angle by which these elements should be turned by, because they're going to be, we want the elements to basically fill in the whole circle like perfectly, accurately, no space left behind. So we have to figure out the accurate circle angle that should fill that space. So basically, we need to first involve how many, we need to know how many elements there are, and then, well, we have to divide it by 360. Well, 360 divided by the amount of elements there are, so that we can turn these elements later on with a loop that goes through these elements. And so, for example, the first element will be turned by this angle times 1, the second element will be turned by this angle times 2, the third element will be turned by this angle times 3. Actually, the first element will not be turned by that angle, it should stay as it is, and then the second element will turn times 1, the third element times 2, the fourth element times 3, the fifth element times 4, and so on until it fills in the whole carousel so that there's no space behind. So in order to do that accurately, we're going to create a constant, and we are going to basically have we're going to select the value 360, as that is the full angle of a circle, and then divide it by the number of elements in that circle. However, we need to turn this, right now it is in degrees format, so we have to turn this into radians so that we can use, later on we're going to use a little bit of trigonometry in order to basically determine where these elements should be positioned or how far stretched it should be, each element should be. So we are going to have to turn this into radians, and so we're going to have to multiply this by pi. So we can use this function called math.pi, and then we're going to divide all of this by 180. Alright, so now we're just going to create a comment so that we know that this angle is in radian form. And so now we are going to create a variable in a constant form. So in our function, we're going to call this update slider. And so we are going to create a loop here. So in this loop, we want to first select the container, because now the container has items due to the for loop that we've added, and we've appended all of the list items into the container, so the container has elements inside. So now we want to use query selector so that we can select each of these elements, and we want to apply a certain value for each of these elements individually, and we want a specific function to be executed that we'll be creating very soon. So we're going to select all the list elements specifically, and so we're going to create that for each loop. And we're going to assign a name for each of these list items, or list items, yeah. So we can name it any name that we want. So in a for loop, it would be I, but we can name it any name that we want to, as well as here. So we can name it S, I, or we can name it slider or list item. Then we just want to keep it short, so we're just going to keep it to one letter, and we're going to call it S. So now we want to set the top value and the left value to be towards the center of the carousel. We've added position absolute earlier on, as you can see here. So now we can set the top value and the left value freely. So the first thing that we want to do is set the top value, or basically the vertical part of the list item, and we want to center it. And we don't want the top part of the list item to be towards the center. We want the center of the list item to be towards the center. So we'll first use the calculation property so that we can adjust this. So we want it to be to be positioned towards 50% of the container, of its container. So the top value, the top part of the list item will be towards the center. But we want the center of the list item, not the top part, but the center of the list item to be towards the center. So we are going to subtract it by half of the list item. So we've earlier set the width and the height of each list item to be 200. The diameter is 200 pixels, so half of that should be 100. So we want to get half of that, and the element diameter could be changed. Could be maybe 400 pixels, could be 600 pixels, or could be 100 pixels. So we don't want to just set 100 pixels just like that. We're just going to we're going to use this $sign and curly brackets so that we can select the element diameter, whatever value that it is set to, and we want to divide it by 2 so that we can get the radius, or we can get half of that element's width and height, and we can set it properly towards the center more accurately. And we're going to end with pixels, and we're going to do the same exact thing for the left value. So the same principle applies for the left value. The left part of the element will be towards the center, but we want the center of the list item to be towards the center, so we need to get half of the list item horizontally, and half of the list item would be 100 pixels in our case. So we have to divide element diameter by 2. So now the next thing that we're going to do is, well, before we continue, let's first call update slider so that the changes are then applied. So now, well, right now the width and height of the carousel of the list items are not yet, they're not yet assigned to 200 pixels. So we can just set it there for now. So we're just gonna add a comment, name it temporary, and so we're going to set the width to be specifically what we set it to, and actually we need it to be in pixels. So we'll use this $sign, curly brackets, and then set it to element diameter. And we're going to set the exact same thing for height. So now it is properly towards the center of the carousel as we'd like it to be. And yeah, so that's temporary. So now what we want to do is we want to create a function, and we're going to call it here. We're going to execute it in this loop, and it should be executed every time for each of these elements. So what we're going to add before this, we're going to also create a constant, and we're going to call this distance. It could be diagonal distance or distance. Actually, to be more clear, let's call it diagonal distance. So as mentioned earlier, we're going to be using trigonometry. So we're going to be working a little bit with triangles, and right angle triangles to be more specific. So there'll be two sides that are straight and then one side that is diagonal, and so we want to set a specific value for this diagonal distance, which will be the same for each of these elements, so only that the angle is changing. So basically, as all the elements are going to start from the center, they're going to be moved to particular parts of the carousel by the same distance, by the same diagonal distance that we're going to set right now, but different angle, so that the turn of each of these elements will be different, only that the distance from the center will always be the same. Okay, so we're going to set the distance to be the radius, or the radius of the carousel. And the radius of the carousel, we can get it by first calling container, and we can use client width in order to access the width or the radius of the container, the full width of the container, or the full diameter, and then divided by 2 to get the radius. And in order to make it slightly smaller, to give more spacing between, because if we set it to this, it means that all of the elements will properly touch the full carousel, but we want there to be some spacing from the carousel to all of these list elements. So we're going to subtract it again. This is not necessary, this is not very important, but we're going to subtract it again by element diameter, and we want the radius of that element diameter so that there's a little more spacing, as if we added padding spacing in the container. So there's more spacing. It doesn't, the list items don't directly touch the carousel. There's spacing, so the carousels will start from here and not from here, but that's not important. You can also just remove that and set it as this. That would be fine as well. So now we can carry on with the function. And so in this function, we want to take with us a few elements that we've defined here. So the first thing is the current element that we're processing. Second element is the angle. We need the angle. Next thing is we need the element diameter. Another thing is we need the container, and another thing is we need the diagonal distance. So none of these elements have been defined just yet, hence why everything looks a little bit crooked. Only the first element is towards the center, but everything else hasn't been processed yet because the function does not exist. Is not existent. So we're going to create this function here called Carousel, and we're just going to keep all the names just the same as we have named it up here. Alright, so now before we continue, we have to add another variable into the function we have to take, because we need to be able to identify what position that element we're processing is, like for example, it's the first one, the second one, the third one, the last one. We need to get the value, the number, so the position. So we're going to create a variable and we're going to call it current pause. We're going to set it at 0, and we're going to be using update slider for the later on when we're clicking on previous and next. We're always going to call update slider. So this is now just when the page loads in the beginning, and so we are setting current pause to be 0, and we're going to also pass this variable into the function so that we can use it as well in order to create different widths and heights later on, though we're now focusing on placing these elements into their respective positions. Later on we'll be working on the slider, like the functionality of the slider. So now we want to get the current position, and every time this function finishes, the current pause should be incremented, so from 0, 1, 2, 3. And now we are going to create a constant, and we're going to call this multiplier. And basically we want to use current, we're going to set it to current pause, and we're going to be adding a few more values for multiplier later on, but now we just want to focus on putting the elements in their respective positions. So before we get onto the technicalities or the math side of this functionality, we're first going to create another constant, and we're going to call it x formula. And basically, actually before that, we're going to first determine the angle turn, or rad turn, because the angle right now is not in degrees but is in radian. So we want to know by how much the circle should be rotated by, so that we can put it in particular places. So remember, they're going to be placed in different places according to the same distance, the same diagonal distance, but different angling, so that they're in different places in the carousel. So they're going to have different angles, and here's where we're setting that. So we need to get the angle. So for example, that could be 20 degrees, that could be 40 degrees. It just depends on how many items there are in the carousel, how many list items there are. And then we're going to multiply this by the multiplier. So for example, the first one should be here, and it should not be turned by any angle, so it should be 0. So basically, current pause, which starts at 0, will be assigned to the first element. So it will be angle times 0, because we don't want it to be turned yet. So we want it to start from here. So we're going to leave this for now, but we are going to be adding a few more variables shortly. Okay, so now we are going to now create the x value and the y value, so the positioning, where it will be positioned. So we're going to call the x value x, and actually we call it x formula. And then we are going to now use trigonometry. We're going to apply trigonometry right here. Alright, so as you can see, we have screenshotted our carousel, and all of the elements represented by these circles are positioned in their respective places. So we are going to start, all the elements always start at the center of the carousel. And so the first one will not be turned by any angle. It will only be moved by the diagonal distance that we set it to, but it will not be turned by any diagonal. It will just be downwards. So we're going to focus on the second one here. So when we create a mini triangle, let me just use these shapes. We're going to create a triangle. Well, first let's start with a slanted line, and we're going to start from the center of the carousel to the center of the element. And so this is how we want it to be. We want the circle, which starts here, to start from the center, and then we want to move it by a certain distance, and that's the diagonal distance that we already set here. Okay, the radius of the circle, basically the radius of the carousel, I mean. So in order to reach there, we need to get the x value and the y value. So we're going to create 2 more lines, and this time it will be straight lines. So 1 vertical line and 1 horizontal line, and we want to ensure that it is placed in a way where it creates a right angle. Okay, so now we've created a right angle triangle, and that is needed so that we can apply trigonometry. And so we can add now a right angle. Let me see, yeah, right here. And so right now, the information that we have now is we know the diagonal distance. In our case, as mentioned earlier, the current width of the container is 800 pixels, so divided by 2 is 400. And then the element diameter is 200 pixels, so divided by 2 is 100. So 400 minus 100 is 300. So the value from here to here, the diagonal distance is 300. So we're just going to write 300. Okay, so now what we want to do is we cannot just move it straight up like that, but we have to move it this way. So we have to figure out the x value by which it has to be moved by, and then, sorry, this is the y value, and the x value by which it has to be moved by. So here we can, actually this is y, oops, and here is x. Okay, so another thing that we also know is the angle, the rad turn, which is basically represented. So the angle is basically 360 divided by the amount of elements that we have, which is 8. So each element will be turned by a specific value, and then it will be multiplied based on where it's positioned. Like for example, the first one will be 0, it will not be turned. The first one times whatever angle it is times 1, whatever angle it is times 2, and so on. So the second, so let's say maybe the angle is 20 degrees. The angle that we set here is 20 degrees. So then over here this will be 20, by here it will be 0 degrees, then 20, it will be moved by 20 degrees, and then over here the rad turn will be times 2, so 40 degrees, over here times 3, 60 degrees, over here times 4, 80 degrees, and so on. So we're going to start with the second element, which is by 20 degrees. So we know two things. We know, so we can apply trigonometry here. We know the length of the diagonal distance, we know the angle, and we know that this is a right angle. So that helps us a lot. So now we need to find the x value and y value, and the way we can do this is we can use SOHCALC. So from here, this value would be O, and this value from here to here, because of the right angle, and because the right angle, the side that is opposite to the right angle is the hypotenuse, so this will be h. So that means we are going to be using sin in order to find the x value. So sin and the degree, the angle that is known is 20 degrees, and then we're going to find the x value, which is O, and h, and 300, which is the h value, because it's going to be O divided by h. So in order to find the value of x, we have to multiply 300 by sin 20, and then we'll get the answer for the x value. And then another thing is the y value. So for the y value, it will be different because y is positioned differently. So y is positioned in a place where there's an angle here and there's a right angle here. So this will be the a value. We'll delete this, however h will stay the same. So this is a ka. This week we can create a ka, we can use the cos or the ka principle. So ka being a divided by h. So it will be cos, and then the angle that we have that is revealed, which is 20 degrees, and a divided by h. So a being y, oops, a being y, okay, this keeps changing what I've written. Yeah, so a divided by h is 300. So in order to find y, it will be 300 multiplied by, or the diagonal distance, whatever it may be, multiplied by cos 20 degrees, or whatever the angle is. So by this we can find x, the x value and the y value. We can apply this in our constant. So for the first one, x value, it will be, we know that it is sin, the angle multiplied by the diagonal distance, which we saw before was 300. So in our case it would be 300, but the diagonal distance, no matter what it is. So we're going to apply this here, math sin, and then the angle that it should be turned by is by rad turn. So that's just basically the angle multiplied by the position, the current position. So whether it be whether it be 0, then it shouldn't be turned. The first one, it should be turned by a certain amount. Third one, it should be turned by a certain amount, so that they will all have different places in the carousel. So math sin, the rad turn, and then multiplied by diagonal distance. So that's the angle sin multiplied by diagonal distance, and then the same thing for formula, but for y, however, it's going to be cos rad turn multiplied by diagonal distance. Okay, so now this hasn't been applied in our carousel yet, in our elements yet. So we're going to take the element, the current element that the loop is processing, as this function is in a loop, and that's stored in the s variable. So we're going to use transform in order to transform this, so that we can use translate. And so with translate, we can transform the list item from the particular position it is in, which should be at the center, and then it will move by x value, by a certain x value, and the y value, which we have set here now. So with that, we're going to use a variable and some string, so we're going to have to use these special string characters, and so we're going to use translate. Okay, and so the first value, so we're going to use x and y. So the first value that we're going to add is the x formula, as the first value is x. Okay, and now the value that this generates may be a huge number, so we're just going to minimize and deduct that by 3. So it's still just as accurate, only that it is not, we're not dealing with a lot of decimals and we're not over exhausting the machine. So we're just going to reduce it to 3 decimal numbers. Okay, and so that's in pixel form as we're dealing with CSS. So another thing is, the second value that we should include is the y value, which we have stored in y formula. Again, we're going to fix it to 3, just 3 decimals. And by pixels, whoops, that should be outside the curly brackets. And now we can see how Carousel looks nice and smooth.
Thank you for watching this video. This was part 1 of the Carousel tutorial. In part 2, we demonstrate how you can create a moving carousel by the click of a button. Subscribe to Codelicious for more videos like these and stay tuned.